Alright, what's up? I am David Long. Welcome to the next episode of...
What you talking about, Wilbur?
Today we're going to be talking about AMness before the Big Bang. Take it away, Wilbur.
So of course you want to work to alleviate suffering, and you want to work to alleviate hunger. But on the absolute side, the analogy is if you're in a dream at night and there are thousands of people starving, there are two ways you can stop their hunger. One is in the dream you can try to feed them all, or the second is you can wake up, and that will end their suffering immediately. So you want to try to get a sense of AMness, stripped of objects, and realize that if all objects are gone, there is still AMness. No objects at all. The fundamental, ongoing AMness. The AMness is the only thing that exists. Everything else is a modification, a ripple, an arising. AMness is ongoing, unchanging, ever present. 5 millennia ago, there is only AMness. Before the Big Bang, there is only AMness.
The ground of all being. Here the deepest secrets of the universe show themselves.
And so as you get that sense of ongoing AMness, it's no objects whatsoever. And it is absolutely infallible. You don't complicate it. If you're aware of I am, that's it. That's it.
Love is not just a feeling, but this drive towards unity actually goes all the way back to the Big Bang.
This ongoing, ever-present knowingness called AMness. And it existed now, 5 minutes ago, 5 years ago, 5 decades ago, 5 centuries ago, before the Big Bang. And before the universe was, I am. And that is the fundamental, absolute secret of the great traditions. It's a secret all called to realize. Fundamentally, every major wisdom tradition wants you to move from an identification with finite phenomenal events. And this is a fundamental rule we find in meditation, absolute subjectivity. They're trying to get in touch with absolute reality, and you experience this emptiness and openness because it's a space in which everything is arising right now. God is pure subject in you.
Alright, so now you're getting a taste of what we're working with here. I'm going to hold Wilbur to his own standards. I'm an integralist. I'm going to hold him to integral standards. So he's breaking the rules of integral theory in 3 different ways here. He's qualifying the unqualifiable. He's looking in the wrong quadrant for data, and it's also a pre-trans fallacy. He's qualifying the unqualifiable. He's making claims about that which is beyond anyone's ability to know. He's making absolute truth claims. You're not supposed to be able to do that. You know, the map is not the territory. Like, even our objective measurements are not the thing in itself.
Everybody knows the map is not the territory. Nobody knows this better than I do. I do not confuse the map with the territory. I don't take the map that seriously.
Like, he's very serious about this idea that the map is not the territory, but at the same time, he's going to say that he can qualify the absolute and make claims about the absolute nature of reality. No.
He who thinks he knows doesn't know. He who knows that he doesn't know, knows. The ultimate unqualified mystery is beyond human experience. It becomes inflected. As they say, there is a condescension on the part of the infinite to the mind of man, and that is what looks like God.
So whatever it is we experience, we have to express in language that is just not up to the occasion.
That's it.
It's
That's what poetry is for. Poetry is a language that has to be penetrated. It doesn't shut you off. It opens. It's the rhythm, the precise choice of words that will have implications and suggestions that go past the word. And then you get what Joyce calls the radiance, the epiphany. The epiphany is the showing through of the essence beyond names and forms. No tongue has soiled it. No word has reached it. Words are always qualifications and limitations.
The main issue with this qualifying the unqualifiable or making claims about the absolute truth of reality is that there's a problem with integrity. You're making claims about things you don't actually know. And so there's a problem with epistemic humility, which means that you think that you can know more than you can actually know, like your epistemology isn't rigorous enough. So there's a problem here also with intellectual honesty. These are all major problems with authenticity, and this is a really important thing if integral is actually going to be good and successful and true. We have to be in line with integrity, intellectual honesty, and authenticity, openness to what's actually true beyond our own personal bias.
Anything that we find in the realm of physics cannot apply to this unqualifiable, because physics works with things that are qualifiable or quantifiable. And so it's working with some form of manifest finite event. And emptiness, if you will, is the ground of all of that.
This same criticism also applies to phenomenology and subjectivity. Subjectivity is also incredibly limited. Your subjective perspective is not the absolute truth of reality.
People like Deepak Chopra will tell you that in the darkness of your closed eyes, you can realize your identity with the one mind that gave birth to the cosmos. This is a specious claim. There's nothing about meditation that is akin to doing cosmology, and you don't get insights about what preceded the Big Bang from doing any of these practices. But this is where we encounter true intellectual atrocities. I've studied with great mystics. I've met great meditation masters who've spent 20 years in caves perfecting the kinds of techniques of meditation that you would adopt or recommend. They don't know a damn thing about physics. Having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head. You can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head or synapses in your head that are doing anything. It's called absolute subjective ignorance of what's actually going on outside your consciousness.
And everything we know, all of the archetypes in our mind and everything like that, are based on our experiences of objective reality and things that people have told us. Qualifying the unqualifiable is not just putting qualities on emptiness. Qualifying the unqualifiable is trying to speak about that which is unspeakable, or trying to act like you know things that are beyond all categories of human thought, the absolute truth of reality. And it's actually a common theme in traditions, both East and West, that we can't make claims about the absolute truth of reality. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Or in Gnosticism, the idea of gnosis is this experience that can't be spoken about or can't be put into words. That's why the original Gnostics don't have a dogma. I would argue that to some extent, even the story of Moses, where God appears to Moses in a burning bush.
Holy, I'm burning the bush. Moses! When I was high upon the mountain, God revealed the truths of the so much drama in the Israel BC. It's kinda hard talking directly to the G-O single D. Hand me my chisel, I got a new command missile for y'all.
And he says, I am that I am. At the time, within the tradition, in the context, this is not a name. You might even say that it's God's way of saying, I'm not saying, I'm that which cannot be named. Or I am that I am being itself.
'Cause I am whatever you say I am. If I wasn't, then why would I say I am?
At the time, the idea was that if you could call upon a god by its name, then you could kind of have power over it. You could call it up and have it do your bidding. But with this kind of relationship with God, this relationship of being itself, there was this mysterious element to it. Like it was beyond Moses' ability to name or to grasp or to hold down with his own concepts. Like God would blow his freaking mind. Like God is beyond his ability to fathom. That's deep within the Christian tradition. I would say one of the main themes that seems to occur across a lot of traditions is this realization that the absolute truth is beyond our ability to imagine, this idea of absolute mystery. He's looking in the wrong quadrant for data. He's looking in his upper left quadrant, his own subjective experience. He closes his eyes, and the world isn't there anymore. There's no more objects. It's just pure awareness. And so, therefore, he concludes that AMness exists beyond all objects. Well, we could kill off every sentient being.
Oh, I can't believe you just said that!
And reality would still exist. This is the reverse of this kind of logic. We have about 9 billion years in the universe's history before there was a planet with an ecosystem, with an environment that life evolved on. So to think that consciousness is primary is wrong, as we talked about in the last video. Most scientists have an emergentist perspective. We don't think consciousness goes all the way down and back. So it seems to me that this logic doesn't really work. It doesn't really line up with the evidence that we have. Let's take a deeper look at integral methodological pluralism and some of the rules around validation in the different quadrants, the strengths and limits of the different approaches to truth according to integral theory. And in particular, the limits of personal experience, especially in relation to this topic of spiritual experiences. So when it comes to the limits of both science and phenomenology, science is not allowed to invalidate your personal experience. If you had this experience, that is your experience. You had that experience, that is a true subjective fact about your life, that you felt this, you saw this, that was your experience. But on the other hand, you don't also get to say that just because you had an experience that you know that it's true about reality. You have to test that to see if it actually stands up with the facts. Because it turns out that just being in touch with the ground of all being doesn't reveal the deepest secrets of the universe.
The ground of all being. Here the deepest secrets of the universe show themselves.
These extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and it seems like the evidence that they're presenting is not really that extraordinary.
The deepest secrets of the universe.
They're either making unfounded claims or they're not really revealing truths that science can go verify, and then we're like, wow, it's amazing that you brought this to the table and we were able to verify it and prove that it was true.
The deepest secrets of the universe.
That's not what's happening. If that was the case, that would be impressive. That would be like, wow, your meditative experience is really revealing something deep, but that's not what we're seeing here. So this is something that Integral really has to grapple with. It's not just as simple as putting all the factors on a map and being like, that's the upper left, this is the upper right.
Phenomenology is real and material science is real, but where phenomenology tries to deny material science, don't listen to it. And where material science tries to deny interiority and phenomenology, don't listen to it. Phenomenology is real and material science is real.
You have to really figure out what the actual limits and validation processes are for each one of these things, how they tie together, and what trumps what kind of a thing. So it's important to know that your personal experience can only tell you about your personal experience. You have to actually test your personal experience to see if it's true. Personal experience is actually incredibly limited. That's why humanity devised the scientific method and the reproducibility and test and falsifiability and peer review, as well as these instruments to be able to expand human senses, to be able to really figure things out. And what we found is, through all of our disciplines, for the most part, what's going on is not what it seems, or it's not just the way that you would think that it is. There's a lot more nuance to what's going on than what meets the eye. So just the fact that there was such a huge scientific renaissance, I think, goes to show that subjectivity and phenomenology are probably the most limited and some of the least trustworthy sources of information. So your personal experience can tell you what you felt, that's for sure, but it doesn't get to make claims about objective reality, let alone the absolute truth of reality. Objective facts can tell us a lot about objective, tangible, exterior reality, but you can't reduce a person's personal experience to brain waves or brain states or something like that. If you really want to know what's going on with a person, you have to talk to them, you have to ask them what they feel, what they felt, what they experienced. And just saying, well, that's not really true, doesn't necessarily negate the importance and the meaning and the value and the significance of those personal experiences. So these are different categories. What's true, what's significant or meaningful or beautiful. And they can't be conflated. They're different questions. Ultimately, I'd like them to be harmonized because I think actually what is of most importance is the good, what's good for everyone. But in order for us to be able to be good, we have to understand what's true so we can be good for what is true. And then we should align ourselves with what is good and do it in a way that's beautiful. So to some extent, I think beauty is cheap. I think almost anything can be seen as beautiful. What's most important is the good, and the way to get at the good is through the true. Let's make the truth beautiful. That's the way all of these things harmonize with each other. When you mess up the prioritization, you can get into some serious trouble.
The proof lies in an awakening, an interior awakening or satori.
It doesn't, though. I used to be on the worship team at my church, and people would come and they would be singing along and stuff like that, and the pastor would get on the microphone and he would say things like, God is talking to you, he's pulling on your heart, he wants you to come up here and rededicate yourself. So he's basically using that voice in their head and like hypnotizing them, putting this suggestion in their mind, planting this idea of an internal conflict. And of course, nobody wants to come to the front, but everybody also knows that they haven't perfectly lived up to their highest potential, and so they're feeling a little bit guilty, so they prey on that guilt. And so you go up to the front and you have this experience where you get filled with love and forgiveness and this idea of starting over. And then a lot of people, when you ask them why they believe, it's because of something like this, because they've had this experience where they feel the love of God in their heart, and they feel forgiven, and they feel like they're starting over. It makes them feel good. And to them, it also proves the truth of their tradition. But it doesn't. There's nothing about that experience that proves Jesus was a historical figure who was raised from the dead and flew up into the sky. And we're dealing with the same kind of thing here, where it's like they tell you a story and then they push you into an experience, and then you understand the experience in the terms of the story that they've already been telling you. It's circular reasoning. It's inside the box, inside the tradition kind of suggestion, and the experience doesn't prove the religion true. This is one of the main things that any religious person has to grapple with, is what do you do about the fact that there are other people in other traditions who also will claim that they know that their God is true because of some kind of spiritual experience. You're both using the same methodology of personal experience and faith, and yet you're coming up with different conclusions. So how does that work?
If you look at the great traditions, they all agree that there are at least 4, usually 5 major states of consciousness that everybody has access to. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep are the simplest. I'm writing this just across the top. This is gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. The waking state, dreaming state, deep, formless sleep state. What we find is that if you take somebody at a particular stage of development, here I'm using the simple Gene Gebser stages. So I've written archaic, magic, mythic or traditional, rational or modern, pluralistic or postmodern, and integral or higher. You can be at a traditional mythic stage, and if you experience these states, you'll interpret it in those terms, because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. And so we get a grid here that shows these, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 24 different types of spiritual experience that you can have. If you have a peak experience, as I was saying, let's say you're at the mythic stage or wave of development, and you have an experience of a subtle being of light, and you come from a culture that's Christian, you very likely interpret that as Jesus, perhaps. And because you're at an ethnocentric level of development, you will believe that unless somebody has an experience with Jesus, they can't be saved. It's a very, very common thing that happens. You can be at the rational level of development, like Bertrand Russell was, for example, and he had an experience of nature mysticism, but he interpreted it, of course, in rational terms. That's almost all you can do. And if you experience these states, you'll interpret it in those terms, because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. It's very common. It's culturally molded. If you're in China or in Southeast Asia and you have an experience of light, it might very well have 10,000 arms. It might very well be Avalokiteshvara. You're never going to find a Southern Baptist seeing 10,000 arms, which is very, very rare, because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. It's very common. It's culturally molded.
So that really is all that you can do, is understand your experience in the light of your own worldview. And often that means that we understand these experiences in the terms that are given to us, in terms of the stories that are told to us by these traditions about what these experiences mean before we even have them. So this is a problem of the limits of interpretation, or the limits of our mind's ability to understand what's actually going on. And this goes back to this idea of the map is not the territory and qualifying the unqualifiable. And it also touches on this next distinction that we're going to be making about pre-rational interpretations that are magical and mythical, and trans-rational interpretations that are metaphoric or poetic. How literally do we take these symbols? How literally do we take the way that we talk about these things? How lightly do we hold them? And how much do we claim that they're the right and one true way? So when it comes to this claim about cosmology, I wish we could just make it explicit. I wish they could just explain to me the logic. I want to know why it's a good idea to postulate this as a good idea in the first place. People talk about these kinds of claims like I had an experience. I want to know what the logic is. Ken Wilber gives this example of the moons around Jupiter.
Neuroscience and deep science. And there are 3 very, very famous schools of epistemology. The first is an injunction. And it's always in the form something like this. If you want to know this, you must do this. So it's raining outside. If you want to know if it's raining outside, go to the window and look. Scientific knowledge isn't lying around out there. It's paradigm dependent. Now, paradigm doesn't mean some theory that I can make up. It means you have to come up with an injunction that brings forth the data. But once you follow the injunction, then there's something called an illumination or a data or an experience. Look through the telescope, you'll have an experience. There's a very important point to that. If you don't follow the injunction, you won't have the experience. If you don't look through Galileo's telescope, you're not going to see the moons of Jupiter. Third is some form of confirmation. I look through this telescope, I see what I think are 4 things going around Jupiter. You look through it and tell me what you see.
Like, what's the logic? How do you get from this experience to this conclusion about cosmology and the absolute truth of the universe? I looked through this telescope and I saw that there were these dots floating around Jupiter, and so I assumed that there are this many moons around Jupiter, right? So that's based on some logic. I assume that when I look through the telescope that I'm looking out at space. I assume that this dot is Jupiter. I assume that these things spinning around it are moons. Like, that's a string of logical premises that come together to form a conclusion. So I want to know what the logic is that leads from like a nirvikalpa samadhi or, some kind of an emptiness experience, this ultimate meditative state that they get to that reveals this kind of absolute truth about everything. I want to know what the logic is. It's got to be something like, I close my eyes and I get rid of everything, and so absolute subjectivity, like that, like I was talking about earlier.
So you want to try to get a sense of I-amness, stripped of objects, and realize that if all objects are gone, there is still I-amness. I-amness.
Which is not reasonable. Either that or they justify that in the box, in the tradition, translation of an experience as, well, I feel at peace, I feel good, and so that makes me think that this traditional interpretation of an experience is valid. which is also not reasonable. Part of the reason you won't really get it explained to you logically like this is because if you actually spelled out the logic and wrote out the premises, it'd be so easy to rip these premises apart, as we have already done. This whole thing is built on faulty logic. That's why most of these mystical people would rather play like they're beyond logic, or that if you don't agree, it's because you're not practiced or mature enough. So they want to act like it's a rational claim, but they'll quickly try to move the conversation out of the rational, reasonable, scientific domain and into another domain where they can act like they're superior somehow, and if you don't agree with them, it's your own fault.
But most clever version of confirmation is Karl Popper's falsifiability. So he said a hypothesis isn't scientific unless you can think of some way that you can falsify it. Because otherwise we have no way of telling. You can just say whatever you want and nobody can get at it, and it might be a hunch, metaphysics, philosophy, but it's not science. Now, those three strands of good knowledge can be applied to any domain. So here's Hamlet. You want to say, what's the meaning of Hamlet? First of all, you have to read it.
Sleep, perchance, to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep we'll get what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil.
You have to follow an injunction to get into the data domain. Once it's in there, you're going to have an experience. Ah, Hamlet did this, Hamlet did that. Then you're going to check it with somebody else. There's no one right interpretation of Hamlet, but there are a million wrong ones. Hamlet is not about a picnic in Hawaii. That's false. Well, I just applied all three strands of science to any form of knowledge. Zen, meditation, the same thing. There are all three strands. And if you meet all three strands, you pass all three empirical tests or epistemological tests for good knowledge. One is, if you want to know if there's Buddha nature, start counting your breath. Do that for 5 years and get back to me. But there's an injunction. You have to train the instrument. Once you follow that injunction, you'll have an illumination. You'll have an experience. You'll have a satori. You'll have a kensho.
I notice when he talks about the peer-reviewed proof, the proof is that people have an awakening or a kensho or some kind of a satori or some kind of an experience. He doesn't say that the proof is that there's an AMness before the Big Bang. He equates the two.
You'll have a kensho.
Oh, I have a kensho.
You'll have some form of experience. Then check it with a community of the adequate. The community of the adequate means people that have done number one and number two.
But there's actually a big problem with this idea of a religious community of the adequate, because they end up basically denying anybody who disagrees with the religious dogma. Then you go from the idea of having something like an honest, open peer review to this kind of condescending idea like, well, until you agree with me, you're not as mature as me, you're not as realized as me. Keep practicing, and maybe one day, when you agree with me, you'll be as mature and good as me. So it quickly devolves into something like that. I'm telling you, the emperor has no clothes. Ugh, and it's a gross body. Talk about integral naked, right? When the conversation starts going this way, you need to ask about contradictions. What do you do about other people who also say that they believe based on their personal experience, and what the logic is? How do we go from the experience to the claim? These are the two things that people who make these kind of claims need to deal with. Also, what happens is Ken Wilber winds up demonizing science, strawmanning science, and arguing for a minority position that most scientists wouldn't agree with. So a big problem is that Integral doesn't have a healthy relationship with science. So a lot of what we're talking about right now is about integrating some of the orange scientific factors that are not harmonizing or that are not being taken into account or included in some kind of healthy way. And when you don't include it in a healthy way, then it comes up as shadow, as a problem, as criticism. And until we as a community are able to deal with these things in a healthy way, we're not going to be able to really grow or move forward. And as integralists, we're supposed to be the best at looking at our shadow and integrating everything and being really skillful. And so it's really up to us to deal with our own shadow issues and to do it skillfully. So that's one of my motivations for working on this project in the first place.
Then check it with a community of the adequate. The community of the adequate means people that have done number one and number two.
I'm a long-time meditator, and I don't agree with his dogmatic literal interpretation. I know Sam Harris is a long-time meditator. Probably both of us have been doing it well over 10 years as a part of our daily practice. And we don't agree with his interpretation. There's tons of atheistic Buddhists out there who have been in these states who don't agree with this worldview.
The insights a person can have, as I said, tell you nothing about the universe and cosmology, but they do confirm some well-established truths about the nature of the human mind, and certain of these truths are worth knowing in that they enable us to live better lives.
So not only do you have a problem of contradiction in terms of Ken Wilber's tradition doesn't agree with other traditions in the way that he says that they do, but Ken Wilber's tradition doesn't agree with itself on the inside either in the way that he wants to say that it does. So these are contradictions that need to be taken into account, both on the outside and on the inside. And if we're going to say that these claims are true and that this position is reasonable, I want to know what the logic and the evidence are to support this position. But definitely, what we've been presented with so far is not going to cut it. So pre-rational ideas are magical and mythical, rational ideas are logical and rational, and trans-rational ideas are poetic or metaphorical, where you can use the language of multiple traditions in a way that cashes out with science and with rationality and with truth. So it's one thing to claim the traditions maintain or that it's the dogma and appeal to authority. It's a whole other thing to say that it's reasonable and you have logic and you have evidence, and it's a whole other thing still to say that it's one poetic way of talking about things and that it cashes out in accord with these other traditions in the ways that they line up with science. So we're talking about pre-rational mythology here. We're talking about ideas that evolved before there were microscopes and telescopes. We're talking about traditional mythology. And if you want to say that it's rationally true, then it has to stand up to rational standards. But that's not the same as claiming that it's trans-rationally true, which would be to claim that it's metaphorically true. And then how does that as a metaphor cash out in a way that's true? But claiming that it's true is a rational claim.
If they're making an empirical claim, check it empirically.
Right, and how does that usually go?
Completely failed in every test that they've been given.
Exactly. So this is the pre-trans fallacy. So Wilber is holding on to this traditional dogmatic idea. And so yeah, there are these traditional ideas and some people take them literally. There are also rational worldviews and the simplistic scientific, empirical, reductionist worldview is a worldview that some people have. But you wouldn't want to reduce all scientists to an empirical reductionist, just like you wouldn't want to reduce all religious believers to fundamentalists. These traditions grow all the way up the spiral. So the problem is when you get to the postmodernist stage, this early vision logic is that there's still pre-trans confusion going on. On one extreme, that can look like far-sighted mishmashing, and you can get kind of this clusterfuck of contradictory different ideas. And on the other side of the extreme, you can get this kind of conflating all the traditions into the one tradition that you like we're seeing Wilber doing here. But it is a form of pre-trans confusion and bad integration. A more mid and late stage version of integration is the skillful harmony of the religious symbols in accord with science. And this is where I think the emergentist perspective is the best, most healthy view that really takes into account the truth from all different quadrants. Also, it's important to say that emergentists are not exterior quadrant reductionists just because we think the exterior quadrant is primary, just like idealists are not interior quadrant reductionists just because they think that the interior quadrant is primary. We all include all four quadrants. The question is about primacy. It's also good to point out that idealism is an absolute truth claim and a dogmatic claim, where emergentism is an objective fact claim based on things that we can measure empirically. It's not at all an absolute truth claim. So that's an important distinction. He's taking one tradition as if it is literally true, the one true way, like this one Eastern tradition gets it right.
That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth. And it's that sense of AMness. The journey of enlightenment, if you want to put it in a simplified form, is the journey that moves you from your empirical self, anything that you can see or know about yourself, any object, to pure awareness, pure self, your true self, the self that cannot be made an object, but is the space in which all of this is arising. That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing.
Joseph Campbell, probably the recent era's greatest mythology and interpretive mythology, and somebody I certainly cut my teeth on. I was a great admirer of his and thought really extraordinary work that he did. He used to very, very vehemently, actually, say that there's really sort of two types of mythology. Your mythology performs two different functions. He wouldn't use the terms pre-rational and trans-rational, but the way we're talking about them is the way he would talk about these two functions of mythology. And the first function is when mythology is taken to be concretely real. The fundamentalist, religious believer, they don't take these things metaphorically. These are not symbols of some higher truth. These are the truth. Now, Moses really parted the Red Sea. It doesn't symbolize anything. All of those would be what Campbell would call concrete, literal belief in mythology. What some people do, particularly educated, intelligent people like us that are trying to get some meaning in our lives, we can tend to take myths as deeply symbolic of something else.
That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth. And it's that sense of AMness.
The fundamentalist, religious believer, they don't take these things metaphorically. These are not symbols of some higher truth. These are the truth.
And not a mythic, literal fairy tale.
What you talking about, Wilber?
So he's not reading this mythology as a form of human psychology projected through archetypes as poetry. He's reading it as actual history and cosmology. as actually true. And there's nothing about being a person from the Bronze Age that gives one special knowledge or special ability to be able to tap into the absolute truth. In fact, it's the opposite. These people existed before microscopes and telescopes, and even though the Hindu cosmology is very sophisticated and gets closer to what we know through science about the vastness of everything, it is still an anthropocentric mythology, where ultimately it comes back to that it's all just some human somewhere that did all of it for a purpose and a reason and with love and a consciousness and all that kind of stuff. So he's making this claim that all of the great traditions come to this same conclusion. But what he's really doing is he's collapsing all of these mountaintops into the one that he prefers.
What always happens when people want to push the great religions into one box, into one mountaintop, rather than many mountaintops, is you come up with your own ad hoc idea of what mountaintop is. Oops, it just happens to be my vision of what religion should be. So maybe ultimately there's one God, who maybe sounds and talks and walks a lot like Jesus. Or, maybe it's the mystical experience, which just happens to be the piece of religion that you value. Or maybe it's compassion, which just happens to be your particular preoccupation with what the religion should be doing. But in any case, it's you.
Fundamentally, every major wisdom tradition wants you to move from an identification with finite phenomenal events, absolute subjectivity.
Well, in Christianity, there's definitely a theme of dying to the flesh or dying to the ego and living for God. But they definitely wouldn't consider God to be absolute subjectivity. That's where you're kind of conflating everything into your particular worldview. And you're not doing it in a consistent way. Christianity wasn't really trying to say Buddhism or Hinduism. That's some unskillful, far-sighted mishmashing. There's a difference between recognizing universal themes and trying to say that every religion is actually Buddhism. It's really not at all the case that all the world's traditions believe in this interior God. It seems to me most of the world's tradition believe in an outside creator God. The Eastern tradition is actually pretty rare in that regard. There are some other variations on Christian traditions where you have God both inside and outside, which are pretty similar, but it's not exactly the same. He's saying, oh, well, these other things, they kind of sound like my thing, and so he reduces them to that. But his particular version of cosmology, of AMness before the Big Bang, is not the Christian one, which is what we talked about in the previous episode about integral evolutionary spirituality, where we compared Ken Wilber's worldview to that of Steve McIntosh, two people who are trying to pass off what they're doing as integral evolutionary spirituality and the religion of tomorrow, and yet they're both advocating for their own biased, traditional, literal cosmology. If you are a very astute observer, you will find out that my criticisms of Wilber in this video are pretty much the same criticisms I have of Steve McIntosh in my criticism of him. Unfounded claims, qualifying the unqualifiable, pre-trans fallacy, and an unhealthy relationship with nature. All of these same things are factors here with Wilber too. So let's talk real quick about the consequences of holding this worldview. So this actually does turn out to be a huge issue. It might seem like it's not a big deal, but it actually affects every single topic he touches. It ultimately affects his view of psychology. It affects religion, obviously, and the way that he integrates that. It affects his relationship to science. And it's had a negative effect on his relationship with academia, our ability to make progress in the world to some extent, as well as it's caused a lot of drama and disconnection and problems within our community. And we'll talk about a lot of these things in further videos. This is the kind of problem that philosophically affects your whole metaphysics, your whole ontology, your whole epistemology, your whole way of translating and understanding and relating to reality through the lens of this particular worldview. It's actually fundamental. And so to some extent there are different kinds of integralists. So what other personal, philosophical, and ethical problems might there be? Well, consider this question that Ken Wilber has asked.
It would seem that it doesn't really matter whether we continue to have a role in this play.
In this play?
The humans.
Sure.
Why should we care?
Ooh. Yeah, good one. Good one.
Yeah, so this is a very important question, it seems to me, and the answer will be very revealing.
So of course you want to work to alleviate suffering, and you want to work to alleviate hunger. But on the absolute side, the analogy is if you're in a dream at night and there are thousands of people starving, there are two ways you can stop their hunger. One is in the dream you can try to feed them all, but the second is you can wake up, and that will end their suffering immediately.
See the problem with that? It's spiritual bypassing. It's treating reality like it's just an illusion. What's an illusion is separateness. Separateness is an illusion. The universal theme is not AMness before the Big Bang. The universal theme is absolute unity beyond the illusion of separateness. at-one-ment or atonement. I and the Father are one, the body of Christ in Christianity, and Buddha nature, or all is one, or we're all part of the same source, or nature mysticism, and we're all part of nature in paganism. This is the universal theme. It's unity. Unity in the way that's actually scientifically true. This is the way all of these traditions harmonize around unity. It's a scientific fact. The fractal nature of reality, the interconnectedness of the web of life, E equals mc squared, that we're all one energy field. The fact that we are stardust, that we're the universe becoming conscious of itself. There is a way to take this higher absolute perspective where you realize that David is just a mythology that I've been initiated into, that I perpetuate to get beyond my ego and my separate self, culturally conditioned awareness, and realize that I am nature. You know, I'm the Lorax, I speak for the trees, or whatever it is. Like, I am this reality. I'm one with everything. This higher enlightened realization of absolute unity and non-dual perspective still works very well in an emergentist perspective without any supernatural ideas. And it's frankly the more open and honest perspective, because when it comes to absolute truth of reality, we're honest about the fact that we don't know what the absolute truth of reality is. Could all of this just be a simulation on a quantum computer somewhere? I don't know. You have to realize that when Buddha was first talking about his experience, he was translating it in the light of Hindu mythology. So he was talking about his awakening to absolute unity in terms of the creation myth of the worldview and the culture that he lived in. So you have to divorce the actual truth of awakening to absolute unity, to being one with the absolute, from the local traditional claims about cosmology and the local creation myth.
That's almost all you can do. And if you experience these states, you'll interpret it in those terms. Because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. It's very common, it's culturally molded. If you're in China or in Southeast Asia and you have an experience of light, it might very well have 10,000 arms. It might very well be Avalokiteshvara. You're never going to find a Southern Baptist seeing 10,000 arms, which is very, very rare. Because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. It's very common, it's culturally molded.
And see the awakening to this absolute unity is a higher perspective, but it has to cash out in a way that's actually true. The metaphor has to align with reality, otherwise it's a superstition or a delusion. The metaphor has its deep poetry when it's true. And we can't be making claims about this stuff based on some tradition that we like. We have to have a fair, universal, overarching standard for this kind of stuff, and an integration that actually harmonizes all of these traditions in a skillful and fair way. If we don't do that, we're not making a map of what's actually true, our shared agreements. We're making a map of our own personal preferences, and that is a nightmare, as Ken Wilber says himself.
Really want to go back and look at all of the major sciences, philosophies, religions, and so on. It's like, what important piece of truth are they offering? Certainly when it starts, it can be a very subjective thing. Well, I like this, I don't like that. And all of a sudden, you don't really have a map of reality, you have a map of Ken Wilber's preferences. And that's exactly what you don't want. I mean, that's a nightmare.
All right, thanks so much for watching. I know we did go a little bit long on this episode. Keep your eye out for the next episode. It's going to be about strawmanning science, and it's going to go a little bit more in detail in that direction. Also might have interviews with Frank Visser and Michael Dowd coming up. Keep an eye out for that. I would highly suggest that you watch my integral epistemology video and my videos about the pre-trans fallacy. I actually have a much longer video called Semantic Compatibilism, a post-formal or trans-rational view, which goes in depth around this idea of trans-rationality and what that really entails. Definitely check for these links and more down in the description. Definitely looking forward to your feedback in those comments below. I see you typing. Also, definitely make sure you check out the previous episodes, the introduction to the series, as well as the video on integral evolutionary spirituality. Make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you share with your friends. Support me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time. Peace.